I always considered myself a man of steady principles. My life wasn't perfect, but I took comfort in the routine. Breakfast at the same oak table every morning, a family that seemed complete, and a wife whose charm could disarm anyone. Though over the years, I'd grown suspicious of the intent behind her smiles. Claire was unpredictable, a whirlwind of emotions, but I chalked it up to her passionate nature. After all, who wanted a dull marriage? We had 3 children, each as unique as the seasons. Our oldest, Brian, was 22 and fiercely independent, already making his way in the world. Our middle child, Ashley, at 19, was a headstrong college freshman with an eye for justice, always debating politics or the ethics of something I couldn't quite follow. Then there was Ethan, our youngest, who had recently turned 17. Ethan was the one who still brought warmth to the house, whose innocence reminded me of what family should feel like. And then there was Claire. She was my high school sweetheart, though looking back, I wondered if that label had blinded me. Claire had always been magnetic, her laughter drawing people in like moths to a flame. But over the years, her laughter grew more hollow. She became quick to anger, prone to dramatics, and frighteningly skilled at twisting every argument to make herself the victim. Still, I stayed. I told myself it was for the kids, for the family we'd built together. I ignored the growing sense of unease in my gut, the strange glances she exchanged with other men, the frequent girls' nights that ended suspiciously late, the locked phone that never seemed to leave her side. Trust was the foundation of any marriage, wasn't it? If I accused her without proof, what kind of man would I be? But trust, I would learn, was a fragile thing. It was a week before Ethan's birthday that I first noticed the change in Claire's behavior. She became uncharacteristically cheerful, almost giddy, in a way that didn't feel right. She spent hours getting ready to go out, her outfits more daring than I was used to. She claimed she was just trying to feel young again. I let it slide. Maybe she needed to feel desirable, and maybe I hadn't done enough to make her feel that way. It wasn't worth a fight. Ethan's birthday was a modest affair. We hosted a backyard barbecue, inviting some of his friends and a few family members. Among the group was Ethan's childhood friend, a young man named Jason. Jason had grown up with Ethan, practically living in our house during their younger years. At 21, Jason was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded a cocky charm that bordered on arrogance. Claire seemed to take notice of him almost immediately, but again, I dismissed it. Jason had always been like family. Why would I think otherwise? Looking back, I should have paid more attention to the way her laugh lingered just a little too long when Jason told one of his stories, or how her eyes seemed to sparkle whenever he entered the room. But hindsight is a cruel teacher, and at the time, I thought little of it. I had other things to worry about. Work deadlines, our bills, and the unshakable feeling that my family was drifting apart. The day after Ethan's party, I found Claire in the kitchen, humming to herself as she scrolled through her phone. I made a passing comment about how happy she seemed lately. Can a woman just enjoy her life without being interrogated? She snapped, the sweetness in her voice replaced by icy defensiveness. It was always like that with Claire. Any question, no matter how innocent, became an attack. I didn't press further. I learned long ago that arguing with Claire was like trying to hold back the tide. But the cracks in our marriage were becoming harder to ignore. I could feel them widening beneath my feet, threatening to swallow me whole. And yet, I still held on, clutching at the fraying edges of a life I thought was unshakable. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that something was terribly wrong. Claire's breathing was soft and even, the picture of tranquility. But my mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to answer. Little did I know the answers were coming, and they would tear my world apart. A week after Ethan's birthday, life resumed its normal rhythm, or so it seemed. Claire kept herself busy with her usual activities: yoga classes, errand runs, and endless phone calls with her best friends. I focused on work, trying to ignore the disquiet that lingered in the back of my mind. But the memory of Claire's unusual behavior at Ethan's party wouldn't let me go. Jason had stopped by the house a few times since the party, always under the guise of visiting Ethan. The two had been close for years, but recently, Jason's presence felt different. He was a frequent visitor now, showing up even when Ethan wasn't home, claiming he was just dropping something off or waiting for Ethan to return. Claire always seemed to be conveniently in the room when Jason arrived, her tone brighter, her smile wider. It was subtle at first, but once you know something is wrong, every detail becomes a potential clue. I started watching, piecing together fragments of behavior that might have seemed innocuous to anyone else. One evening, I returned home early from work to find Claire and Jason in the kitchen. She was laughing at something he said, her hand resting lightly on his arm. When they noticed me, the laughter died, replaced by a strained awkwardness that set my nerves on edge. "Hey, Dad." Jason greeted me with his trademark confidence, flashing a grin that felt just a little too forced. "Just waiting for Ethan. You should be back soon." Claire chimed in quickly, almost too quickly. "Jason was just helping me move some boxes from the garage. You know how heavy those things can get." I didn't know how to respond. I nodded stiffly, brushing past them to drop my briefcase in the study. From the hallway, I could hear Claire's voice, softer now, as though trying to keep their conversation private. But when I stepped back into the kitchen a few minutes later, Jason was gone. Claire turned to me, her expression neutral, almost bored. "What's that look for?" "What look?" I asked, feigning innocence. "Don't start," she said sharply, her eyes narrowing. "I've had a long day, and I don't need your suspicion on top of it." "I didn't say anything," I replied, though the accusation lingered unspoken between us. Over the next few days, my suspicions grew. Claire became more guarded, her phone always in her hand or tucked away in her purse. When I asked her who she was texting, she'd roll her eyes and mutter something about work stuff or just the girls. Her explanations felt rehearsed, lacking the warmth and spontaneity of truth. One night, while Claire was in the shower, I gave in to the temptation I'd been fighting for weeks. I picked up her phone, my heart pounding as I swiped at the screen. But it was locked, and I didn't know the passcode. My stomach churned with frustration and guilt. I hated what I was becoming, a man who doubted his own wife, who felt the need to snoop through her things just to find peace of mind. When Claire emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel and humming a tune, I quickly placed the phone back on the nightstand. She didn't seem to notice, but my hands were still trembling as I pretended to read a book. The turning point came a few days later, when Ethan asked me to transfer the videos from his birthday party onto his laptop. I'd filmed most of the event on our family camcorder, capturing the laughter, the toasts, and the chaotic energy of a house filled with teenagers. It was a simple task, one I didn't think twice about. As I scrolled through the footage, something caught my eye. In the background of one clip, during the cake cutting, I noticed Claire and Jason standing off to the side. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a fleeting moment that might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been looking for it. Claire's hand was resting on Jason's hip, her fingers brushing dangerously close to the waistband of his jeans. Jason was smiling, leaning in slightly as though sharing a private joke. The rest of the room was focused on Ethan and the cake, oblivious to the exchange happening just a few feet away. I paused the video, staring at the screen as my stomach twisted into knots. My mind raced, torn between disbelief and the undeniable truth of what I was seeing. I rewound the clip, watching it again and again, hoping I was imagining things. But the evidence was there, undeniable and damning. I felt the first flicker of rage then, a fire that started low in my chest and quickly spread. Claire's betrayal wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was a reality, caught on film and burned into my memory. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. Confrontation was Claire's battleground, and I knew she'd find a way to twist the truth, to make herself the victim and paint me as the villain. No, if I wanted the truth, I needed to be smarter. I needed proof that she couldn't deny or manipulate. And so, I waited, the fire inside me growing with each passing day. The days following my discovery of the video were some of the longest of my life. Every interaction with Claire felt like a balancing act, a struggle to keep my emotions in check while the evidence of her betrayal weighed heavily on my mind. I started paying closer attention to her behavior, noticing the small, calculated ways she avoided my questions or brushed off my attempts to connect. And then there was Jason. He continued to visit the house, his presence a constant reminder of what I'd seen. I found myself watching him, dissecting his every move for clues to confirm what I already knew. It was torture, but I couldn't look away. The breaking point came late one Friday night. Claire had gone to bed early, claiming a headache, while Ethan and Ashley were out with friends. I stayed up, pretending to work, but my thoughts kept returning to the video. The image of her hand on Jason's hip was seared into my brain, a relentless loop that wouldn't stop playing. I decided to watch the rest of the footage. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe I hoped to find something, anything, that would explain away what I'd seen. I transferred the remaining videos to my laptop, settling in with a glass of whiskey as I clicked through each file. Most of it was harmless. Kids laughing, Ethan opening presents, the usual chaos of a birthday party. But then I found another clip, one I didn't remember filming. It must have been recorded by accident. The camera left running on a table or shelf. The angle was low, the frame slightly tilted, capturing a corner of the living room where the party had spilled over. At first, it seemed unremarkable. Guests mingling, chatting, and sipping drinks. But then, in the corner of the screen, I saw them. Claire and Jason. They were standing close, too close, their heads bent together in whispered conversation. Her hand moved again, this time gripping his thigh just above the knee. Jason shifted, glancing around nervously, but he didn't move away. If anything, he leaned closer, his arm brushing against her waist. I paused the video, my heart hammering in my chest. This was no innocent interaction. There was a familiarity in their movements, a level of comfort that spoke to something deeper, something more intimate. The air seemed to leave the room as I stared at the frozen image on my screen. I rewound the clip, watching it again, my hands trembling with anger. Every instinct in me screamed to march upstairs and confront her, to demand an explanation for what I'd just witnessed. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I saved the clip to a separate folder, labeling it simply, evidence. The next morning, I acted as though nothing had happened. I kissed Claire on the cheek as she sipped her coffee, pretending not to notice the way she avoided meeting my eyes. I made small talk about the weather and Ethan's upcoming college applications, all the while feeling the weight of the secret I carried. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was calculating. Claire had always been manipulative, skilled at twisting the truth to suit her narrative. If I confronted her without proof, she'd find a way to turn the tables, to make me doubt what I'd seen with my own eyes. I couldn't let that happen. So I waited. I watched. And I planned. The opportunity came a few days later, when Ethan mentioned he wanted to head downtown to meet some friends. Claire perked up at the news, her interest piqued in a way that made my stomach churn. "I can drive him," I offered casually, watching her reaction. "You got plenty on your plate already." No, Claire said quickly, waving off my suggestion. "I don't mind. I've been cooped up all day anyway. It'll be good to get out." I smiled, masking the fury that simmered beneath the surface. "Thanks. I might just use the time to get some rest." When Saturday rolled around, I made an excuse to leave the house shortly after Claire and Ethan drove off. I followed at a safe distance, careful not to arouse suspicion. Sure enough, after dropping Ethan off downtown, Claire didn't return home. Instead, she made her way across town to Jason's apartment complex, parking a few spaces away from his car. I stayed in my own car, watching as she walked up to his door and knocked. Jason answered almost immediately, his expression lighting up at the sight of her. She stepped inside without hesitation, the door closing behind her. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. There was no denying it now. Claire wasn't just flirting or being careless. She was having an affair, and she didn't even bother to hide it. I sat there for hours, waiting for her to leave. When she finally emerged, her hair slightly disheveled and her cheeks flushed, my suspicions were confirmed. But this time, I didn't feel the raw, uncontrolled rage that had consumed me before. This time, I felt cold, calculated, ready. I spent the next few days consumed by thoughts of Claire's betrayal. Every moment we shared felt tainted now, every smile a mask, every word a lie. I couldn't look at her without imagining her with Jason, her laugh meant for him, her touch stolen from me. But the anger that simmered inside me wasn't aimless. It was focused, sharpened into a blade I would wield when the time was right. The first step in my plan was simple: gather undeniable proof. The video footage was damning, but it wasn't enough. Claire was a master manipulator, and I knew she'd twist the situation, call it a misunderstanding, or accuse me of overreacting. If I wanted to confront her, I needed evidence so overwhelming that even she couldn't deny it. One night, as Claire slept soundly beside me, her breathing even and serene, I reached for her phone. It was risky, but she had made a critical mistake earlier that day. She left it unlocked on the kitchen counter while she made lunch. I had discreetly noted the pattern she used to swipe open the screen. Now, in the dim light of our bedroom, I swiped it open myself, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but instinct told me to check her messages. I scrolled through her conversations, finding the usual mundane chatter with friends and family. And then, buried near the bottom of her chat list was Jason. I opened the thread, my stomach lurching as I read the messages. Jason, can't stop thinking about last time. You drive me crazy, you know that? Claire, you're the one driving me crazy. I don't know how I'm going to keep my hands off you Thursday. Jason, don't even try. Same time, same place. Claire, absolutely. I'll bring dessert. The words blurred on the screen as a cold rage settled over me. There was no longer any doubt. Every excuse, every fake smile, every deflection, it was all a cover for this. The woman I had spent my life with, built a family with, was sneaking off to be with a boy half her age, one who had grown up in our home like a second son. I took screenshots of the messages and sent them to my email. I stared at the thread a moment longer, my hand tightening around the phone. Part of me wanted to wake her right then, to shove the evidence in her face and demand an explanation. But I knew it was too soon. Claire was a master of theatrics, and if I confronted her now, she'd turn the whole thing into a whirlwind of tears and excuses. No, I needed to be smarter. The next day, while Claire was out running errands, I began phase 2 of my plan. Her car was my target, a sleek, cherry-red convertible she treated like a newborn. It was her pride and joy, a tangible reminder of her vanity. To her, that car symbolized freedom, power, and the life she wanted people to believe she had. I decided it would become a symbol of her destruction. I drove the car to an empty lot on the outskirts of town, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. I parked in the center, the silence around me heavy, oppressive. In the trunk, I had everything I needed: a gas canister, matches, and a bundle of rags. As I began pouring gasoline over the car's polished hood, a strange calm washed over me. The smell was sharp, almost medicinal, as the liquid pooled and dripped down the sides. With every splash, I felt a weight lifting from my chest, as though I were purging years of frustration, betrayal, and anger. When the car was fully doused, I stepped back and lit the first match. The small flame flickered in the breeze, a fragile, beautiful thing. I stared at it for a moment, mesmerized, before flicking it onto the car's hood. The fire caught instantly, roaring to life as it spread across the glossy surface. The flames danced wildly, devouring the car with a ferocity that mirrored my own emotions. I stood there, watching as the fire consumed it, the heat washing over me in waves. The tires burst with sharp pops, the windows shattered, and the paint bubbled and peeled away to reveal scorched metal beneath. In that moment, the car became a metaphor for my marriage. Once shiny and perfect on the outside, it had been rotting from within for years. The fire was a cleansing force, stripping away the illusions and exposing the ugly truth beneath. It was beautiful in its destruction, a violent symphony of endings and new beginnings. I thought about Claire's face when she realized her beloved car was gone, reduced to ash and scrap. Would she cry? Scream? Blame me for not protecting it? The thought brought a grim smile to my face. She would finally feel the sting of loss, the way I had felt it every day since I discovered her betrayal. When the fire had burned itself out, leaving nothing but a smoldering shell, I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. That night, Claire returned home, oblivious to what I'd done. She hummed a tune as she prepared dinner, pausing to text on her phone with a small, secret smile. I didn't need to ask who she was texting. I already knew. The morning after I burned Claire's car, I awoke to a strange calm, as though the act had siphoned away the storm that had raged inside me for days. I didn't know how long the calm would last, but I was determined to use it. I needed my focus now more than ever. Claire's reaction came sooner than I expected. "Have you seen my car?" Her voice rang out sharply, pulling me from my thoughts. I looked up from my coffee to find her standing in the kitchen doorway, her face pale, her expression teetering between panic and confusion. "No," I said evenly, setting my mug down. "What do you mean?" "It's not in the driveway." Her tone climbed, the panic in her voice growing. She began pacing the room, her phone gripped tightly in her hand. "I parked it there last night. I always park it there. It's gone. Maybe it was stolen." I kept my voice calm, almost bored, though inside, I savored every flicker of her unraveling composure. "Did you leave it unlocked?" She shot me a glare, the accusation in her eyes palpable. "Of course not. I'm not careless." "Then call the police," I said, feigning concern. "You got the insurance, right? They'll figure it out." Her lips parted as if to say something, but she stopped herself. Instead, she grabbed her purse and keys, muttering something about filing a report as she stormed out of the house. I watched her go, suppressing the smirk tugging at my lips. That was one piece of her perfect image gone. The car wasn't just a possession to Claire. It was a symbol of the life she wanted people to believe she had. Without it, she was vulnerable, stripped of one of her shields. But this was only the beginning. The next part of my plan required precision. If I was going to confront Claire, it had to be on my terms, not hers. I needed to expose her lies so thoroughly that even she couldn't spin the truth. Her betrayal couldn't be a private wound. It needed to be public. That evening, I took the next step. While she showered, I reached for her phone. I'd learned her pattern passcode days earlier, when she'd unlocked it absent-mindedly in front of me. My fingers traced the pattern easily, and the screen blinked to life. I scrolled quickly through her messages, my hands trembling with a mix of anticipation and dread. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Conversations with friends, family, and coworkers. Then, near the bottom of her chat list, I saw it. Jason. I tapped the thread, and there it was, the confirmation I had been waiting for. "Jason, Friday can't come fast enough. I need to see you. Claire, you're not the only one counting the days. I'll bring dessert. Jason, deal. Same time, same place." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I took screenshots of the messages, sending them to my email for safekeeping. There was no longer any doubt. Claire wasn't just a liar. She was a fool to think she could hide this from me. When I heard the water shut off, I locked the phone and placed it back on the nightstand, slipping out of the room before she could see the fire burning in my eyes. The following days were a waiting game. I played my role perfectly, attentive, even affectionate, pretending to be none the wiser. Claire, to her credit, seemed to buy it, though I caught glimpses of guilt in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. She thought she was clever, that she had me fooled, but she didn't know the trap was already closing. Friday arrived faster than I expected. That morning, Claire was almost giddy, her nervous energy poorly hidden behind a practiced smile. "Any plans tonight?" I asked casually over breakfast. "Just meeting a friend for drinks," she replied, her tone light, dismissive. "I shouldn't be too late." I nodded, pretending not to notice the extra care she'd taken with her makeup, or the way her hands fidgeted with her coffee cup. "Have fun," I said, forcing a smile. "You deserve it." She kissed me on the cheek before leaving, the lie still hanging in the air. I waited an hour before following her. I knew where she was going, Jason's apartment, but I wanted to give her enough time to let her guard down. When I arrived, I parked a safe distance away. The lights in Jason's apartment were on, casting a warm glow against the darkening sky. For a long moment, I sat in my car, gripping the wheel tightly. The air felt heavy, charged with the weight of what I was about to do. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What would I say? What would I do? But no matter how much I tried to prepare, I knew there was no perfect script for this confrontation. Finally, I stepped out of the car, my movements slow and deliberate. As I approached Jason's door, I could hear laughter filtering through the thin walls, their voices soft but unmistakable. My jaw clenched as I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone and activating the camera. The glow from Jason's apartment window mocked me, the faint shadows of movement inside twisting my gut into knots. The laughter and low murmurs leaking through the walls turned into a roar in my head. Every second I hesitated was another second Claire and Jason thought they could get away with this. My anger surged, boiling over into something primal, something unstoppable. I didn't knock. I kicked the door in, the wood splintering with a crack that echoed down the hallway. The force sent it swinging back against the wall, and I stepped inside, my blood pounding in my ears. The room smelled faintly of cheap wine and sweat. And there they were, in the middle of the small living room, on the worn couch that now felt seared into my memory. Claire and Jason were entwined on the couch, their closeness undeniable. The flickering TV cast a dim glow over the room, highlighting the betrayal in their actions. The sound of the door slamming open froze them mid-motion, her hands resting on him, his hands gripping her waist. For a split second, it was as if time itself had stopped. Claire's head snapped toward me, her face pale with shock and fear. Jason's mouth hung open, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Daniel!" she shrieked, scrambling off Jason with a sudden, jerky movement. She practically leaped from the couch, her body twisting awkwardly as she tried to pull herself together. The way she had positioned herself was seared into my mind, a vivid image of betrayal sharper than any knife. I felt sick, the bile rising in my throat, but I couldn't look away. Claire scrambled to cover herself, grabbing Jason's shirt from the armrest and clutching it tightly. Her legs shook as she bent down to retrieve a piece of clothing from the floor. But as she picked it up, I saw it clearly. It wasn't hers. It was a pair of boys' boxer briefs, patterned with a ridiculous cartoon design. It hit me like a sledgehammer. She wasn't just wearing his shirt. She was wearing his underwear. "Are you kidding me?" I growled, my voice shaking with rage and disbelief. "You're wearing his clothes? His underwear? Look at yourself, Claire." Her face burned red as she yanked the boxers up and tried to pull on her jeans, but her hands were trembling too much to get the zipper straight. "Daniel, please, just calm down," she stammered. "I can explain." "Explain?" I barked, cutting her off. I gestured toward Jason, who was still half-dressed on the couch, frozen in place like a deer in headlights. "You don't need to explain, Claire. I can see everything just fine." Jason finally found his voice, his tone shaky and thin. "Mr. Coleman, look, this isn't—" "Shut up," I snapped, turning my gaze on him. "You don't get to speak. Not after this." Jason shrank back, his face pale, his cocky demeanor shattered. He scrambled for his pants, tripping over the couch as he tried to pull them on. It was almost pathetic, almost. I turned back to Claire, who was now fully dressed, but looking more disheveled and panicked than I had ever seen her. Her hair stuck to her face in damp strands, and her mascara was smudged beneath her wide, tear-filled eyes. "This is what you wanted?" I said, my voice low and trembling with barely restrained fury. I pointed at Jason, who now stood awkwardly by the couch, his bare feet shifting nervously on the carpet. "This is what you threw everything away for? A child?" "Daniel, please," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. "It's not like that. Not like that." I let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through my hair as tears blurred my vision. "You were with him, Claire, in his rundown apartment, wearing his clothes, of all things. What else am I supposed to think?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked utterly defeated. I turned my attention back to Jason, whose face was a mask of fear and confusion. "You don't even understand what you've done, do you?" I said, my voice thick with contempt. "You're not a man. You're a selfish little boy playing with someone else's life." Jason didn't respond. He just stood there, his head bowed, his fists clenched at his sides. I turned to Claire one last time. "Look at him, Claire," I said, my voice breaking as tears slid down my cheeks. "This is who you chose instead of me. You think you can just do this?" I growled, my voice trembling with rage. You think you can walk into my house, into my family, and do this to me? Jason stammered something unintelligible, but I was already moving. I closed the distance between us in 2 strides and grabbed him by the front of his shirt. His wide-eyed panic fueled me, the adrenaline coursing through my veins making me stronger than I thought possible. "You little bastard!" I shouted, shaking him violently. His head snapped back and forth as I jerked him like a rag doll. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you even care?" "Stop it, Daniel!" Claire screamed, rushing toward us. Her voice only made my grip tighten, my knuckles widening as I pulled Jason closer, forcing him to meet my eyes. "You think you're a man, don't you?" I spat, my face inches from his. "But you're nothing. You're a selfish, disgusting child who thought he could play with fire without getting burned." Jason squirmed in my grasp, his hands weakly pushing at my chest. "Please, Mr. Coleman. I didn't mean—" "Shut up!" I bellowed, shaking him again. "You don't get to talk. You don't get to explain. You've already said enough. Let him go." Claire's voice rose, and I felt her hands on my arm, pulling at me desperately. "You're going to hurt him." I turned my head toward her, my fury redirected for a split second. "Hurt him? After what you've done? After what I walked into?" She grabbed at my arm again, harder this time, and in the chaos of the moment, I swung my free hand to push her away. The motion was instinctive, fueled by frustration rather than intent, but my palm connected with her face. The sound was sharp, cracking through the room like a whip. Claire stumbled back, clutching her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and tears. Time seemed to freeze as the reality of what had just happened hit me. For a brief moment, the fire inside me dimmed, replaced by a hollow pit in my chest. "Claire," I started, my voice faltering. "I didn't—" She cut me off with a bitter laugh, her tears streaming down her face. "You didn't mean to? Is that what you were going to say? That you didn't mean to?" I released Jason, who slumped to the floor, gasping for breath. My hands trembled as I stepped back, the rage and regret swirling together into a storm I couldn't escape. Claire's sobs grew louder, but they didn't move me this time. I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy, not after everything she had done. "You brought this on yourself," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over her crying. "You and him. You've destroyed everything we built. And for what? For this?" I gestured toward Jason, who was still sitting on the floor, his face pale and his shirt crumpled where I'd grabbed him. He looked less like a man and more like the child I had called him, scared, pathetic, and utterly lost. Claire straightened, her hand still pressed to her cheek, her eyes blazing with anger now. "You think you're the victim here?" she snapped. "You think this is all my fault? You drove me to this, Daniel. You and your cold, distant—" "Don't!" I said, cutting her off sharply. My voice was steadier now, colder. "Don't you dare try to make this my fault. You made your choices, Claire. You chose to lie, to cheat, to betray everything we built together." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked at me, then at Jason, then back at me again, her shoulders sagging under the weight of it all. I looked at Jason one last time, my voice trembling but firm. "You don't deserve her," I said, my tone filled with bitter irony. "But you can have her. You're perfect for each other, a liar and a coward." Jason didn't respond. He just sat there, his head bowed, his body hunched like a scolded child. I turned back to Claire, tears welling in my eyes now, unbidden and uncontrollable. "You threw away everything," I said, my voice breaking. "Everything we had. For him. For this." She flinched, but she didn't respond. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I wiped at my face, trying to compose myself, but the tears kept coming. Finally, I stepped toward the door. I couldn't stay in that apartment a second longer. The drive home was a blur. The world outside the car seemed muted, like the aftermath of an explosion, where the ringing in your ears drowns out everything else. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. The tears had stopped by the time I pulled into the driveway, but the raw wound in my chest remained, throbbing with every beat of my heart. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. The kids were out for the evening, and the emptiness pressed down on me like a physical weight. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, unsure of what to do next. The confrontation at Jason's apartment replayed in my mind like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Claire's betrayal, Jason's pathetic cowardice, the moment my hand connected with her face. I dropped onto the couch, my head in my hands. For years, I'd built my life around her, around us, believing that no matter how difficult things got, we would always have each other. But now, all I could see was the ruins of what we had been, shattered beyond repair. The sound of my phone buzzing pulled me out of my thoughts. I pulled it from my pocket and saw a message from Claire. "Claire, I'm staying at a hotel tonight. Don't wait up." A bitter laugh escaped me. It was just like her to take the easy way out, to run instead of facing what she had done. But for the first time, I didn't care where she was. I didn't care what she did. The numbness that followed the firestorm was all-consuming, leaving no room for anything else. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Ethan and Ashley moving around the house. Their voices drifted upstairs as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I hadn't slept much, but I couldn't bring myself to get up either. I didn't know how to face them, how to explain the truth without breaking them the way I'd been broken. Eventually, I forced myself out of bed. The kids were in the kitchen, their conversation halting as I entered. Ethan looked up from his cereal, his expression curious but cautious. "You okay, Dad?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Yeah," I said, my voice hoarse. "Just a rough night." Ashley studied me with sharp eyes, her intuition unnerving as always. "Where's Mom?" "She's staying at a hotel," I said carefully. We had an argument. The room fell silent, the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the air. I could see the wheels turning in their minds, but neither of them pushed for answers. For that, I was grateful. After breakfast, I retreated to my study, hoping to lose myself in work, but my thoughts refused to cooperate. The image of Claire on that couch, her frantic scramble to cover herself, haunted me. Her betrayal was a wound I couldn't bandage, a scar that would never fade. Later that afternoon, Claire called. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice flat. "We need to talk," she said, her tone hesitant. "I know you're angry, but we can't just ignore this." "I'm not ignoring anything," I said coldly. "I'm done, Claire. You made your choice, and it wasn't me." "Don't say that," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I messed up, Daniel. I know I did, but we can fix this. For the kids. For our family." Her words sparked a fresh wave of anger. "You think this is something we can fix?" I snapped. "You think you can screw around with some boy and then come crawling back when it all falls apart?" "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice rising. "You don't understand." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice shaking with fury. "Don't you dare try to justify this to me. You betrayed me, Claire. You betrayed us. There's no coming back from that." There was a long silence on the line, broken only by the sound of her breathing. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want me to do?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to make her feel every ounce of the pain she had caused me. But another part, the part that still remembered the woman I had fallen in love with, just wanted her to leave. "I want you to be honest," I said finally. "With me, with the kids, with yourself. Stop pretending this is something we can fix, and stop dragging us all down with you." Her breath hitched, but she didn't argue. "I'll come by tomorrow to pack some things," she said softly. "I'll stay with my sister for a while." "Fine," I said, ending the call before she could say anything else. That night, the house felt emptier than ever. I stood in the kitchen, staring out the window at the darkness, and let the silence settle over me. The confrontation, the lies, the unraveling of everything I thought I knew, it all played out in my mind over and over again. The phone rang late in the evening, breaking the stillness of the house. I hesitated for a moment before answering, the unease in my chest tightening as I picked up. "Mr. Coleman?" a stern voice asked. "This is Officer Matthews with the local police department. Are you the father of Ethan Coleman?" My stomach dropped. "Yes, I am. What's going on?" "I'm calling to inform you that your son has been detained." Officer Matthews said. There was an altercation downtown involving him and another individual. We need you to come to the station. An altercation? I repeated, my voice rising with concern. Is he okay? He's not injured, but we'll need you to come down and speak with us. There are some additional matters we need to discuss as well. The officer's tone left little room for argument. I grabbed my keys and drove to the station, my mind racing with questions. When I arrived, a young officer escorted me to a small room where Ethan sat slumped in a chair, his knuckles bruised and a defiant glare on his face. Across the room sat Jason, nursing a split lip and avoiding my gaze. What the hell happened? I demanded, my voice cutting through the tension. Ethan didn't answer right away. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes were red-rimmed, but there was no hint of regret on his face. I talked to him, he muttered finally, nodding toward Jason. And things got out of hand. Jason shifted uncomfortably, his head bowed. The sight of him made my blood boil all over again, but I forced myself to focus on Ethan. What do you mean, you talked to him? I found out, Dad, Ethan said, his voice rising. About him and Mom, I couldn't just let it go. He was my best friend, and he did this to us. The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had done everything I could to protect Ethan from the truth, but it hadn't been enough. Now, my son had taken it upon himself to confront Jason, and it had landed him here. I turned to Jason, my hands curling into fists. What the hell did you say to him? Jason flinched, but before he could answer, the door opened, and Officer Matthews stepped in. That's enough, he said firmly. We're not here to mediate family disputes. Let's stick to the facts. I took a deep breath, trying to rein in my temper. What's going to happen now? We've spoken to witnesses who confirmed there was a fight, Officer Matthews explained. However, both parties are willing to drop charges. This seems like a personal matter that got out of hand. Ethan shot Jason a glare, but he said nothing. I nodded slowly. Fine, is he free to go? Almost, the officer said. His expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious. There's another issue we need to discuss with you, Mr. Coleman. My stomach tightened. What issue? We've recovered your wife's car, he said. Or what's left of it. It was reported stolen, but the circumstances of its destruction raised some questions. I froze, my mind racing. They had found the car. Of course they had. It had been sitting in the lot, a charred husk, leaving behind more evidence than I cared to think about. I forced myself to remain calm, schooling my features into an expression of surprise. What do you mean, recover? I asked, my voice steady. What happened to it? It was found burned out in an abandoned lot, the officer said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Given the suspicious circumstances, we're treating it as a potential arson case. Since you're the registered owner of the car, we need to ask you a few questions. I nodded slowly, keeping my expression neutral. Of course. I'll answer whatever I can, but I don't know anything about this. My wife mentioned the car was missing, and we assumed it had been stolen. The officer studied me for a moment, his gaze searching for cracks in my story. Do you have any reason to believe someone would target your wife's car? Any enemies or disputes we should be aware of? No, I said firmly. Nothing like that. We're just a regular family. Ethan glanced at me sharply, but he didn't say anything. The officer made a note in his pad before nodding. We'll be in touch as the investigation continues. For now, you can take your son home. I exhaled a shaky breath, thanking the officer and leading Ethan out of the station. As we stepped into the cool night air, I turned to him, my voice low and tense. We're going to talk about this when we get home. Ethan didn't argue. He climbed into the car silently, his expression sullen. The drive home was tense, neither of us saying a word. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I turned off the engine and faced him. You shouldn't have gone to him, I said, my voice tight. I understand why you're angry, but that wasn't the way to handle it. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he looked at me with a mixture of anger and hurt. What was I supposed to do? Pretend like it didn't happen? Pretend like everything's fine? No, I said, my voice softening. But getting yourself arrested doesn't solve anything. You're better than this, Ethan. Don't let them drag you down to their level. For the first time, his defiance faltered. He looked away, his shoulders slumping. I can't believe she'd do this to us. Neither can I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. But we're going to get through this. Together. The morning after I brought Ethan home from the police station, I felt like I was balancing on the edge of a knife. Every word, every movement, every thought felt precarious, as if one misstep would send everything I was trying to hold together crumbling into chaos. Claire had texted earlier to say she would come by to pack her things. The thought of seeing her again made my stomach churn, but I knew it was inevitable. Ethan hadn't said much since our conversation in the car. He stayed in his room most of the morning, the door shut firmly as though to barricade himself from the mess outside. I didn't blame him. If I could have locked myself away from this nightmare, I would have. The knock on the door came around noon. I took a deep breath before opening it, bracing myself for what I knew was coming. Claire stood on the porch, her face pale and drawn. She wore a coat over her clothes, her usual confident posture replaced by something hesitant, almost meek. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of everything unsaid filling the space between us. "Can I come in?" she asked finally, her voice small. I stepped aside without a word, letting her pass. She walked into the living room, glancing around as though seeing the house for the first time. I followed her, keeping my distance. "I won't be long," she said, her voice trembling. "I just need to grab some clothes and a few things for work." I nodded, leaning against the doorway. "Fine." She hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the staircase that led to our bedroom. "Where's Ethan?" "In his room," I said shortly. "He doesn't want to see you." Her face crumpled at my words, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Whatever pain she was feeling now was nothing compared to what she had inflicted on this family. As she moved upstairs to pack, I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. The noise from the police station the night before replayed in my mind. The questions about the car, the officer's suspicious tone, the way Ethan had looked at me when the topic came up. The walls were closing in, and I knew I didn't have much time before the police pieced everything together. Claire came back down after about 20 minutes, carrying a small suitcase. She set it by the door and turned to face me, her expression filled with a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Daniel," she began, her voice shaking. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've hurt all of you. But I don't know how we got here." "Don't you?" I said, my voice cold. "You were sleeping with our son's best friend, Claire. You tore this family apart. You don't get to act like you're confused about how it happened." She flinched, but I pressed on. "You made your choices. You chose him over us. And now you have to live with that." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't try to argue. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said softly. It was stupid and selfish, and I know I can't undo it, but nothing." I interrupted. "You can't fix this, Claire. Not now, not ever." She stared at me for a long moment, as if searching for some sign of forgiveness. But I had none to give. Finally, she nodded, picking up her suitcase and heading toward the door. As she reached for the handle, I stopped her. "The police came last night," I said. She froze, her back stiffening. "What?" "They found your car," I said. "What's left of it, anyway. They think it was arson." Her shoulders sagged, and she turned slowly to face me. "Daniel." I stood, crossing the room until I was just a few feet from her. "They asked if I knew anything about it," I said, my voice low and deliberate. "I told them I didn't." Her eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. "You didn't, you wouldn't." "Wouldn't what, Claire?" I asked, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. "Burn the car you loved more than this family? Destroy the thing that symbolized all your selfishness and lies?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she just stared at me, her face pale and drawn. "I covered for you," I said, my voice sharp. "Because of the kids. Because they don't need to lose a father and a mother in the same breath. But don't think for one second that I did it for you." Claire's lips trembled, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. "Get out," I said quietly. "And don't come back." She hesitated for a moment, then turned and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the silence. That evening, Ethan finally emerged from his room. He sat beside me on the couch, his expression somber. "Is she gone?" he asked. Yeah, I said, staring straight ahead. She's gone. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything hung heavy in the air. But there was also a strange sense of relief. The storm had passed, leaving us with the pieces to pick up. I'm sorry, Ethan said quietly. For the fight, for everything. I put a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. It's not your fault, son. None of this is your fault. He nodded, his gaze distant. What happens now? I took a deep breath, the question hanging in the air. Now, I said finally, we move on, one step at a time. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it. He nodded, his silence speaking volumes. As we walked into the house, I couldn't shake the weight of the officer's words. The car, the questions, the investigation. The walls were closing in, and I had to act fast if I wanted to keep control of the situation.